Hi, everybody. This is Arthi from Human Chapters. I'll tell you a little bit about human chapters. Humans are living narratives with a past, present, and future. These narratives constitute of a number of chapters across a lifespan. The aim of these chapters, or the aim of these conversations, is to highlight a chapter of the narrative and unpack its connections to other chapters. I don't care whether people are natural storytellers, but I truly do believe each one of us has a worthy story to share. In acknowledgement to country, we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we meet. We pay respect to their tribal elders, past and present and emerging. We celebrate the continuing culture and we acknowledge the memory of their ancestors. Today, we welcome Shaun back to Human Chapters, and we are going to be talking about his chapter, which consists of supporting school-age children with developmental language disorder. Welcome, Shaun. Tell us a bit about yourself.
My name is Shaun. I am a speech pathologist by background. I have then fused my love of speech pathology and education to look at a population of people that are very near and dear to me, which is developmental language disorder. My journey to this point has really been sort of bit accidental. I don't think I intended to do a PhD on anything, let alone on the topic that we ended up deciding on. But I think it's been really invaluable and given me a lot of, I guess, time for consideration and thought. So this is a really lovely opportunity to share those thoughts with other people.
Thank you so much, Shaun. First of all, tell us a little bit about your PhD and why you chose this topic.
Um, like I said, I didn't actually intend to do a PhD. It sort of just happened. I think when naturally we have lots of questions, or I have lots of questions, you suddenly realize that there aren't always all the answers, or perhaps, you know, people aren't focusing on the questions that you'd like answered. So I really set out with this idea of, well, what do we know about developmental language disorder in schools? We know it's really prevalent. We know that children with DLD often struggle at school. We know that they then have difficulties with their mental health and their employment prospects. But I wanted to really drill down on, well, what's happening in the school space, particularly in an Australian context, because I am based in Australia. And I wanted to understand, well, what is it like for them throughout our education systems?
Before we proceed any further, would you please give us a bit of an explanation of what developmental language disorder is?
Yeah, I can. So, developmental language disorder is difficulties with understanding and using language for no known reason. I like to use the example that sometimes you might have traveled in a country or a space where you didn't speak a language. You might have gone to do something like purchase something or maybe order a drink, and then the person really hasn't quite understood you and you haven't quite understood them. But this is the experience for 1 in 14 people right around the world in their first language. So they'll have difficulties every single day, whether it's in the classroom or at work. And language is really integral to just about everything we do. The benefit of communication is we have a shared way of passing information between each other. And if you don't know how to unpack that, or you don't know how to put it together to share it, it can be a really lonely life. It can be a really hard life for people who don't have communication skills as we'd expect them to. And lots of people can have communication difficulties for different reasons, but the people that I'm most interested are the ones who've had difficulties since birth. That's why we call it developmental. Language means that it's difficulties with communication, and the disorder really highlights the fact that while I don't really like terms like disorder, it doesn't feel very affirming, but what it does say is that it's significant and we need to really do something about it. So putting it all together, developmental language disorder is, this difficulty with communication, and it impacts 1 in 14 people every single day in everything they do.
Um, Thank you so much for explaining that quite clearly. And if we think about the school setting in particular, when you first asked your question, what is it that's happening in the school space for students with developmental language disorder. What are some of the things that that came to your attention?
So there has been a number of studies done on developmental language disorder in schools over the last 10 or 20 years. What we wanted to do was kind of gather those articles up and look at them with a bit of rigor or intention. And so we use this method called a systematic review. A fancy way of saying, we gathered up all of these papers that were kind of related to each other and started to look at how we could kind of group the information. So we looked at grouping it in a few different ways. And the story that made the most sense to me across the 44 papers that we found relating to kids with DLD in the curriculum were that they have difficulties with reading, which wasn't a huge surprise, but we did see that there was quite a lot more information about their difficulties with reading because we know that we require language skills as the sort of the basis for learning how to read. So people with DLD are automatically at a disadvantage because they have difficulties with oral language. And then you try and overlay that with learning how to read. And we call it like a secondary skill, and it reuses other pathways in the brain, that we have an innate difficulty with that. So we see a lot of people in my clinical practice and in the work I've done in schools will have DLD and reading difficulties. So there's a lot of research on that. To a lesser extent, we also saw difficulties with writing. We saw difficulties with telling stories, like narrative skills. We saw difficulties with spelling, and certainly difficulties with comprehension. So these were some of the difficulties we saw more in that literacy space. But we also actually saw a very small group of studies that showed that kids with DLD will struggle with numeracy skills as well. So just a couple of studies, just 3 studies, but we found that they not only had difficulties in English, but also in mathematics. There was a couple of what we call broad studies where they looked at lots of different areas. We also saw difficulties in subjects like science and history and geography. For me, what was really, really interesting was I hypothesized, I thought that kids with DLD would be struggling in all areas. And what we actually found was some kids with DLD can perform in the average range in some curriculum areas, while others perform below where we'd expect them to. We also found that perhaps they weren't as disordered in their profile, but in some areas like reading or spelling, when we matched them with younger children, we actually found that they were following a pretty similar trajectory to their peers, but they were just further behind than we'd expect them to. So, not that we want to tack on a few extra years to schooling, but we might find that if we gave them more time to learn these skills, children with DLD will follow that trajectory over time. So the gap wasn't necessarily widening quite as much as we thought it might be. So they were some of the initial observations we had. What we found well, I found really interesting was the fact that there was 3 skills that were really important in learning. One of those was cognition. Again, probably didn't come as a huge surprise because we need our cognitive skills for learning lots of things like doing, mathematics and arithmetics and understanding, processing information. We also found that their literacy skills, of course, was really important, whether they can decode information and comprehend. But all of that also related to this third area of language. And if we understood a person's language skills, their literacy skills, and their cognitive skills, we got a general sense then as to how they might perform at school. So we know that language is actually really key to understanding student performance at school, but it's often overlooked and not something that perhaps teachers, school principals, policymakers are really considering when thinking about our support strategies for neurodiverse children or children who might be struggling at school.
Wow, there is so much to unpack. There,
Sorry,
Shaun.
Aarti. Just
No,
don't ask somebody to talk about their PhD unless you want a whole explosion of information.
absolutely. And I think this is the idea of the conversation is to delve deeply into the triad, well, deeply as we can and as per
Yeah.
time permits. But tell us what you found next and what you did upon these findings. What happened next?
I guess a lot of research can focus on identifying problems, and I didn't necessarily want to delve too much further into that without starting to balance that conversation with supports. So we found that we had, 44 research studies published over 12 years, and these children were having difficulties. But that really wasn't the end of the story. What we wanted to know was, well, what do we do about it? So I wanted to look at different stakeholder perspectives because we know that speech pathologists traditionally will have a lot of background knowledge on conditions like developmental language disorder, but they don't have a shared role like teachers. Teachers really are the experts in curriculum and classroom management and supporting these students every single day within school. So we wanted to make sure that, of course, we had speech pathologists' voices, teacher voices, but as well as those, parents and caregivers. So we did a big national survey where we asked those three stakeholder groups to share with us their perspectives on lots of different things, but in particular, what do they see are the areas of need for students with DLD at school, and what do they see as the most helpful supports? So we gave them a whole range of different strategies, sorry, different areas. So we gave them 39 activities that children will often do at school. And I have to, acknowledge Beth Saggers and team from the Queensland University of Technology, who very, very kindly actually let me utilize one of their survey structures that they used with autistic students at school. And we were able to adapt that to look at students with developmental language disorder at school. So what we were able to do was kind of tweak those tasks and provide them. And they were things like listening to instructions in the classroom and completing assignments and, listening for the announcements in the classroom. So 39 activities that generally occur every day or very regularly for students in schools. We were able to look at some key areas by grouping them together because we knew that perhaps looking at 39 individual items was going to be a bit tricky. So we grouped them together, and what we found was overall literacy was kind of the area that reigned supreme as having the most difficulties. Followed pretty closely by language and communication. So if we think about the profile of somebody with developmental language disorder, having difficulties with oral language and difficulties with literacy kind of goes hand in hand. So we really saw that in the areas of need, and that came through in the survey's perspectives. What we found then was we provided them with 27 quite common educational supports. These were things like visual strategies or extra time in the classroom, extra time to do their assignments, different tools that are generally in teachers' toolkits, and said, well, which of these do you think is the most helpful for students with developmental language disorder? The number one rated group, so when we kind of collapse them in together, because again, 27 things is a bit hard to look at, we coded them and said, which of these is the most helpful? And we found that providing students with additional time was rated as the most helpful educational strategy for the classroom, followed pretty closely by visual supports. This talks to something, a key point that I raise all the time, that language is sort of this very ethereal sort of thing that as soon as you say something, it disappears. And people are probably listening thinking, I wish I could have it written down, or, I need to listen to it again. And we use these strategies to sort of reconnect with and reinforce what we hear. Whereas in the classroom, language is said and then just disappears. But if we can create something that's tactile and visible, something you can see, something you can touch, something you can interact with, like a visual schedule or a timetable, something that's written down in your diary, all of a sudden it creates a very concrete representation of language. So I wasn't surprised. It was hypothesized that it would be one of our top strategies. So providing students with visual supports is very, very helpful. The third area that we found was rated very highly was to individualize our support. And we talk about individualization a lot, but actually our key stakeholders said across these different tasks, all these different strategies, it would also be very helpful to think about treating children individually and thinking about their individual needs. There were, of course, other strategies, but these three sort of reigned supreme as some of the most rated as the most helpful strategies. If I was to just jump back to needs very quickly, one need that came out that wasn't identified and wasn't necessarily what we were looking for was um, teachers to be aware of developmental language disorder. It was kind of an accidental finding and something that we know that awareness of DLD is quite low globally, nationally, and local level. So it's, again, not unexpected that teachers would have low awareness of developmental language disorder. But we had these really beautiful quotes coming through time and time again from people saying, I just wish my teacher, the teacher of the parents understood developmental language disorder. So that came through as a really, really, really strong theme. So we looked at the needs and then we looked at the supports, but what we ultimately looked at was, did we actually agree across those different stakeholder groups? And what we found was that teachers and speech pathologists were more aligned. We had greater similarities, but generally we found that parents and caregivers rated things as less impactful, so the needs less impacting them on a day-to-day basis, and the strategies being potentially slightly less helpful compared to the speech pathologist and the teacher. We suspect that that's because we've got different roles in terms of educating and supporting a young person with DLD. There's also the influence of the fact that a parent is probably thinking about a single child, their child, whereas teachers and speech pathologists probably work with lots of children, so our views are slightly different. But what was particularly interesting was, although we didn't have a high level of agreement on the needs for children with DLD in schools, we actually found a high level of agreement around the types of supports. So from a clinical perspective or an educational perspective, when we come into those planning meetings, when we're talking about an individual child, it's probably safe to say that we may not necessarily agree on the difficulties they're facing at school, but when it comes to identifying the supports, we're more likely to share and agree though on those, which I think is a really lovely finding from that piece of research.
Um, you've consolidated that incredibly well.
I feel like I waffled, so I'm glad.
No, no, no. And because you talked about the three main supports that work for students with DLD and, extra time, visual supports, individualizing the support for that child. Shaun, I'd love to unpack a little bit about visual supports, and I'll tell you the reason why. Visual supports, giving that recommendation, writing it on their reports or talking to people about it, I feel, just from a personal point of view and from personal practice, I feel like it's trivialized to visual timetables and the number of steps. But something that I tend to see time and time again is, how do we visually represent information, whether it's information in a text, how do we visually represent what they're learning and make it a little bit more concrete? And I wondered if we could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I'm
well,
curious as to what you do.
yes. Oh gosh.
Interview the interviewer.
Yeah. I try to, one of the things I do, and I'll just take a very specific example to make it a little bit easier to understand. If a student is reading a text, literally, I'll go paragraph by paragraph, nothing more than that. And even within one paragraph, something that I want to start to look at from the very beginning is checking for their understanding. Are they understanding after the first or second sentence what we're starting to read about? And I make my own short notes regarding what the text is about. So I can then explain to the student where necessary in short form or in a simplified form, this is what they're trying to tell you. So they're getting that information. And then once they've understood that, then building on that, because texts are written in a variety of simple, compound, complex sentences, compound, complex sentences. They're bringing together abstract concepts, or, the cohesion between sentences and within sentences, within a paragraph and between
Mhm.
paragraphs. We just take so much of this for granted. And so
Absolutely.
checking in for their understanding. But even that idea of, well, this one paragraph is talking about one big thing, and then
Mm.
there are your little points that are supporting that big idea. So that main idea, but supporting details. And I actually try to put that in a bit of an infographic to go, here's your
Yeah.
big idea that they're talking about. Now, these are your little
Mm.
points that are really
Mm.
helping to support and explain this big idea. It works well for nonfiction, but
Mm.
not that well for fiction.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And I feel like I do note taking and show them how a lot of this explaining quite a lot to them. But what I find is I'm a speech pathologist and I know the troubles that the student is having. So what concepts they might find difficult. For example, if it's a timeline, a time orientation difficulty, or what's happened before and after, I can easily identify the sentences that are complex and the student may have difficulty understanding that. So I am putting in things in place with that understanding. My question is, how do we teach this to individuals that may not have that language understanding?
The students that you're working with or your
Or even
colleagues.
adults that are supporting them.
Mm. Yeah. I think first of all, we need to have an awareness. If you don't know somebody needs an adjustment or accommodation, you're very unlikely to actually implement it. I think one of the challenges with DLD is that people with DLD, it's a hidden disability. They just look like everybody else. It's much easier in some ways to use visual cues like a hearing aid or a wheelchair, and know that you need to make it some sort of adjustment or accommodation. But when somebody's sitting in front of you and they don't have any obvious difference or need, that you don't necessarily cue into that. So awareness that it is a neurodevelopmental condition, it is lifelong, and that people as their communication partners need to make those adjustments. I think awareness and is the first step, and then advocacy will be the second step, which is, well, what are we going to do about it? So I think you can get those, we'll work through your question on the basis that perhaps they have that awareness and willing to do that. I think we have to start to unpack and understand how important visual information is. I usually start by teaching others how frequently we use visual supports in our day-to-day life. Calendar, phone that helps me with writing things down quickly, to be able to take notes so that I can remember. So we utilize coping strategies or mechanisms like this all the time to create visual representation of information. Because I know, for example, if my wife tells me something, and unless it is very clear what it is and when I need to do it, I'm probably going to write it down very quickly. So I try to make sure that when I'm explaining visual supports to others, that they really understand how important they are. The other thing is to consider that visual supports look different across ages and stages. The way I might support a little one who's just starting school might be a very colourful, bright visual support. If I did that with my 15-year-old clients, I don't think that they would come back. So we use very discrete calendars, timetables, diaries to make sure that that information is well documented. Um, so visual supports look different across different ages and stages. So making sure that somebody I was working with knows that. And then when it comes down to it, we're trying to think of what the purpose, why are we using this visual support, and what is the information that it helps impart? Is it exactly your example where they've got a whole passage of text, and what we're going to do is we're going to break that down and we're going to identify the key meanings. We might create more white space, we might highlight it. I love using Microsoft just to create more space and use the strategies for highlighting, note keeping, identification. I would also say with story planning or any sort of expressive writing, I'm going to start with some sort of planner. For some children, it might be to draw something out before they even have a go at writing it into their paragraph structure. So, creating a visual representation of what's in their head before then delving into the expressive writing task can also be a really good way of utilizing visual strategies to support oral language. Natural gesture, cueing, signing. If I'm teaching literacy instruction or phonological awareness, and I'm going to use cues for the sounds that we make and how they match with the letters, the graphemes that we use. So you can use gestures as a visual support as well. My children know that when I sort of crook my finger, that means come and come quickly because something is up. So, we use natural gesture in our day-to-day life, and we can actually use that in our classrooms as well. So it can be as complicated or uncomplicated as we want it to be. And I think we put a lot of emphasis on things being beautifully laminated or colored or Velcroed or whatever. But really what we need to think about is what is the purpose of it and how does it help support access to language? And it will look different in mathematics to maybe a job interview or, the procedure for doing their Fryer job at Macca's. Visual supports can look differently. I can think of a young boy who it was very uncool to have a visual support, but he was going to lose his job working at Pizza Hut. So we created a visual support and it went in the back of his phone case that was clear. And so that was something that he could just prop up and look at the visual support, and it followed the procedure for how we needed to add the toppings or the base and the sauce and the toppings and the cheese. So that he could keep his job. So they can really make a huge difference, not just in the classroom, but outside the classroom as well.
Yeah. Shaun, I'm also curious when you were doing your PhD and when you interviewed students as part of your
Oh,
PhD.
you're jumping ahead
Oh,
now.
sorry. Okay.
You can ask. That's where we were going next anyway.
Yes, please tell us about what happened and how you got that information from these
Mm,
students, because there are a few things that I'm very curious about.
yeah. Um, so getting approval to work with vulnerable populations is difficult. But I was very adamant that I wanted the voices of students with developmental language disorder in my research. You heard me talk before about key stakeholders, including speech pathologists, teachers, and parents and caregivers. But at the very heart of that is students themselves. And of course, if my research is on DLD, then I want the voices of students with DLD in it. We tried initially because that was what ethics, other people thought would work best, was to collect the evidence or data using a survey. I knew that the literacy levels of the people I wanted to participate in my research were probably below where we might expect to read a survey and respond. And we tried lots of different ways of structuring it to make it accessible. And we really had very few responses, a very small handful of people in 12 months of recruitment, despite my best efforts. So we ended up hitting pause for 12 months and then starting again. And this time we did interviews. What was different also this time was I went through a co-design process with some autistic teenagers with language disorder who helped not just provide feedback and piloting the survey, but what they also did was they helped with designing the visual support. So to link to your question and the previous chat about visual supports, I knew that I wanted visual supports in my research. In the survey or the interview, sorry, that we wanted to use. But I'm not a teenager. I'm a lot older than that. So I really wanted to get teenagers' perspectives. And I ended up providing them with lots of different options. And what they came up with was not at all what I would have designed myself. Um, what we ended up with was a 5-point scale where we had 1 to 5, which we needed to rate these needs and supports on, but they were anchored by emojis. So, and I gave them lots of different ideas for emojis, but they actually ended up with a happy face at one end, where we knew it was the more positive end of the scale, and a sad face at the other, in very marked green and very marked red. But what they added was, typically we use solid colored boxes, kind of like blue, green, yellow, orange, red. They actually suggested utilizing a gradient from red through yellow to green. And so what we ended up with was this visual support where students would rate, but they could see that there was, a gradient of thought, and they could really think about it. And sometimes they'd really agonize and go, it's kind of a 4, but maybe a low 4, not a high 4, or so they could really demonstrate the nuance and thought that they gave to their responses. So I really loved that particular tool because it was such a great way of getting adolescents to contribute. I didn't sort of use students with DLD because I didn't want to, I knew it was going to be hard to recruit, but I did find students who had language disorders and autism who were able to help with that co-design process. And they really, it was really well considered on their behalf. For me, it meant that I felt like I got a more genuine response from the students who I interviewed. So it was a very small sample, only 11 students, and that took.
So Shaun, you were talking about your small sample. There were 11 students, and while it's small quantitatively, tell us about the strength in the quality of interviews and just, yeah, insights.
Yeah, so we found in some ways very similar patterns of responses to the adults, which was really interesting. They also reported difficulties with literacy and numeracy, perhaps less marked in their perspectives around language and communication. They probably didn't rate it as highly as I thought it was, but I also wasn't aware as to whether anybody had sat down and explained what developmental language disorder was to these students. So, awareness was potentially a part to play there. In terms of educational supports, they actually followed the exact same order of priority as the adults, except for one. The one area that they prioritized much higher was the use of technology in the classroom. Uh, Adults rated it, I think it was second last. It was kind of on the list, but it wasn't high on the list. Whereas the adolescents rated it significantly higher in terms of their priority. They'd love for their teachers and speech pathologists to be using a lot more tech in the classroom, and they gave examples around, OneNote and to be able to utilize their phones and different strategies with software that enable them to be able to engage meaningfully in the learning process. So that was probably the most stark difference in terms of the supports. What was uh, sort of in the back of my mind as I was thinking about this was we actually also looked at their behavior and emotional needs. And this group of people who participated had relatively good behavioral and emotional needs. They didn't have significant emotional problems, conduct problems, hyperactivity. They were interestingly very pro-social, and this is very similar to some work done by Gina Conti-Ramsden in the UK, who found that students with DLD are as pro-social as their peers without DLD. And I found the same in my small sample, that they also presented with some the same level of interest in socializing with peers. Where we saw the most difference was in peer problems. So they want relationships with their peers, but they often reported difficulties with peers. So bullying, avoidance, sort of isolation. They definitely were presenting as having difficulties getting along with their cohort. Not with everybody, but they all seemed to have a story to tell around the difficulties. And that came through on the scale that we used to measure that. It was the area that seemed to be most obviously different compared to some of their peers. So that was, in the back of my mind when I'm looking at this is perhaps I've got kids here who are confident enough or willing enough to be interviewed. But when we looked back to larger samples like Gina's in the UK, she also found pretty similar patterns of behaviour. So maybe my sample is fairly representative, even though it is quite small. Um, when we looked at their perspectives on how connected they felt to school, they really sort of upended my hypothesis. I really thought that they would feel really disconnected from their school environment, that they wouldn't want to go to school. But when we actually used a tool called the psychological sense of school membership, which isn't a bit of a mouthful, but really what it does is it tells us about how do they feel, positively or negatively about going to school. And they actually said things like, I feel really proud of belonging to my school, or people here do notice when I'm good at doing things. And they could mostly as a group, sorry, mostly individually identify whether or not there was somebody who maybe believed in them, advocated for them, supported them. So there was a really, really lovely finding for me, which was despite adversity, despite all of these challenges that these children experience at school, they're still willing to rock up and give it a go. And I just think that is hugely commendable. I mean, I think I would have given up 10 times over. And there's these really amazing kids out there who are just turning up every day, trying their best. And they do have a sense of positivity towards their schooling, which, gosh, I feel as if it's unfounded, but it's right there in the data. So, really interesting, really interesting.
And it's so, Shaun, I can't tell you the number of times I've said this to adults I've been working with, teachers, support staff, to go, imagine being in their brain. Imagine what we are
Mm,
getting them to do day in, day out with their
mm,
difficulties. And
mm,
when they're young, like they still have a smile. Of course, they'll have
mm,
days where they don't want anything to
mm,
do with anyone, the world. It's fine. We
mm.
all have those days, but they're still showing
Yeah,
up to school. They're still engaged in classroom work. They'll still come and sit in during
yeah,
sessions. Yeah, it's quite remarkable.
amazing.
The one thing that I have been curious about, and something that I suppose that curiosity is coming from me trying to explain to teachers, LSOs, parents about concepts, language concepts that students with DLD find difficult, or even students with language disorders are likely to find difficult. And these concepts come up time and time again in literacy and numeracy. And we know that they can have those difficulties. But in your, again, this is not necessarily a PhD, but just even in your expertise, are there some that you have found to be, yep, we need to be mindful of these concepts, and how we teach them, how we target them, how we consider it of breaking them down for our students?
I think for me, teachers are wonderful people
Mm.
who will often make amazing adjustments in learning. I've seen some phenomenal accommodations made, but actually in assessment, it's a point where it can be a little divisive. So assessments could be everybody needs to do the same thing. If I made any adjustments, it's inequitable or it's not a representative, not representative, it's not fair. But there's some things that I think we can do that might set students with DLD up for success, because there's some concepts you need to understand in assessment. For example, there's a lot of cognitive verbs where you have to describe, compare, contrast. And despite the fact that teachers can make some fantastic adjustments in the classroom to explain, support, and scaffold their learning, to provide repetition, to work with their speech pathologist on vocabulary or syntax. So they might have learnt it, but they're not able to demonstrate their understanding in the way that the teacher or marker or examiner might have understood, or be able to show them their true knowledge. So I think that if we can make sure that we break down skills for assessment, particularly, I keep on coming back to those cognitive verbs.
Mm.
They're really important because if you think that something is, you're describing something, but actually what you need to do is compare and contrast, you're not actually completing the task as expected, and therefore you're probably not going to do very well. So, despite and this is what I'm thinking about my clinical experience here. Students with DLD will try and try and try, and they'll get bad marks. And I look at their content. Sometimes their content is actually accurate, it is correct, but it's the way that it's been integrated to show their knowledge and to actually address the task description, that's where they come unstuck. So I spend a lot of time at looking at those sorts of concepts to make sure they can equitably show their knowledge and understanding like their peers. I don't want them to have an advantage. I just want them to have the same starting block as their peers. So probably wasn't what you were expecting, Arthur, around assessment.
No, no.
Um, but I think assessment is a really good logical starting point to work backwards from. If I was to think about some other, I mean, this is vocab again, but if you don't have the vocabulary needed for a subject, then it's really difficult to be learning or demonstrate your learning within that subject. So science is a great example. We use lots of tier two vocabulary or tier three, in some instances, vocabulary. It's very specific to that subject. So we can actually break that down and help make sure that they have a good understanding. You know, it's a really classic example, but children with DLD will often be asked to define something and then use the word to define itself. So, you know, my students know that when they come into my room, you cannot use the word that to define itself in the definition. You know, you have to use other ways of describing it. So we use personal dictionaries as a great example of breaking down words, but I think those language concepts are really key. And then you can scaffold all of this back to your instruction.
Mhm.
So many instances where children with DLD will be sitting in the classroom, looking around, and they have absolutely no idea what's going on. And so they'll copy the peer next to them and they will get in trouble for copying. And, you know, you kind of go through this cycle, or they'll do something and it's so far off the mark, you just think, I don't even know how we got here. So, you know, conceptually making sure that students understand instructions, temporal concepts and positional language is so pesky. Like before this, do that, or after this, do that. You know, they're really simple, but actually make a really big difference. I always laugh at a teacher gave me this example. They said, you know, I asked them to go to the photocopy room to get something, but before they did that, they needed to take something to actually be photocopied. And they were already walking out the door without what they needed. I said, well, I don't think they understood the word before. They just followed it in the logical order that you told them to, which was go to the photocopy room. They probably would have gotten there and thought, now what am I meant to do?
Mhm.
So there's some language concepts like like time concepts that, gosh, once we get those, life is a lot easier. But they're really tricky. And we need a lot of practice sometimes to get them.
And, Shaun, it makes me think about what they're finding difficult. They don't have a full concrete mental representation for. So they continue to find it difficult for
Mhm.
such a long time until that mental representation has been formed for them. And that's where
Mhm.
a lot of these supports are so helpful to go, yeah, that before and after,
Mhm.
highlighting those words and making sure that we're drawing their attention to this.
Mhm.
Yeah, and again, from that test or assessment sort of starting from there, compare and contrast. Well, what is a mental representation for compare?
Mhm.
And what is one for contrast? And they're things, yeah, that are challenging even for adults to think about.
Mhm.
And how do we break that down?
Yeah, absolutely. I usually like to start with my task descriptions and go, what are these? What are the verbs in this? What do we actually need to do? And then pull those out. And all of a sudden you build up this dictionary of all of these words, you know, and they tend to group them into year levels. So you use the same sorts of words to do it in different tasks. So I think it's, yeah,
Mm.
simple, but there's a lot of assumed language in the
Yeah.
classroom. And certainly by the time they get into upper primary and secondary school, most teachers will just assume that you've got a fully fledged typical communicator in the classroom. And when you realize suddenly that two children in a class of 28 are likely to have difficulties, it just opens up a whole different world of the types of adjustments and accommodations we need to use to support young people.
Absolutely. What came next in your PhD journey after the interviews?
Yeah, look, I'd set out in my mind, in my mind, I thought, let's write down something so that there's something physical to hand people to say, here's what to do.
Mm.
We'd call it maybe a practice guideline or guiding principles. As a part of that survey that we did, I said we collected lots of information, not just about needs and supports, but all sorts of things like behavior and transitioning and professional learning needs, all these sorts of things. And one of the things that we asked about was where they've accessed professional learning from before, and then what were they like in the future? And we asked them to rank those. And the idea that I had for supporting teachers was not in the top three. In fact, it was dead last in the priority of things that they really wanted. So it was a bit of a humbling moment because I thought, oh, this would be really useful, right? Um, and what teachers really wanted was professional learning,
Mm.
which in hindsight makes a lot of sense. It was repeatedly stated in different ways, whether it was live or in person, recorded, whatever. There was lots of different ways they could have had it. And it came through time and time again that professional learning would be something that they would really see as valuable.
Mm.
So I kind of took, no, not I kind of, I did take the guts of what I was planning on doing for my guidelines and I developed it into a 90-minute professional learning workshop, a webinar. Um, now, I want to preface the rest of this conversation by saying I'm under no illusion that 90 minutes is going to fix the needs in the classroom of students with DLD. We know that a lot more input is needed over time to support change. However, if we look at the data from our adolescents and our parents and caregivers, they said that awareness of DLD to their teachers was very, very low.
Mm.
And we found that in our study. Um, we then looked at, well, if we can increase awareness, does it change their knowledge of developmental language disorder? Does it change their attitudes towards supporting them? And whilst we would love to change their practices in the classroom, it's a bit unrealistic to expect that their practices will change because of a 90-minute workshop webinar. So let's see if they have any intention to change their practice. So what we ended up doing was a pre and post survey. So yeah, did the pre-survey and then the post survey. Fascinatingly, to go back to the study where we did the survey, it took us 12 months to recruit about 70 something teachers. When it was a professional learning opportunity a few years later, and I do think that DLD awareness has increased and more speech pathologists were diagnosing them. We had over 500 people register in 7 days to participate in the workshop. At the end of the day, we ended up with about 200 who completed all requirements, who did the pre and post and attended all of the survey, all of the webinar. But what we found was that teachers could change their knowledge of DLD in 90 minutes. That whilst they already had relatively supportive attitudes, they had statistically significant improvements in their towards the positive end of supporting students with DLD. They were also more likely to use evidence-based support strategies, or you intend to use evidence-based support strategies. So we were able to see change in all three areas of knowledge, attitudes, and practices following 90 minutes of professional learning. So at this point, we really want to reiterate that it's all about increasing awareness of DLD. The other interesting point was when we actually drilled down to the support supports, the 27 educational supports, most teachers reported to me that they actually utilize those strategies with lots of other children. So one of the big sort of takeaways that I've taken from my PhD that I really want to get out there is that teachers do have quite a large number of educational support strategies in their toolkits. However, if you do not have awareness of the condition, you cannot apply them. So teachers were often saying to me, and have contacted me since to say, oh, I actually did know what, I did have those strategies. I did know what I could do. I just didn't know enough about DLD to know what to do. Now I feel so much more confident. So we've had lots of instances of people saying that something as simple as an online 90-minute webinar can
Mm.
help them feel more confident. And we obviously need to do more work. I've got lots of ideas about how to build on this and support teachers in an ongoing capacity, but I think it's a really good step in the right direction. And it's different. We know that long format training, people like Julia Starling and Pam
Mm.
Snow have done amazing long format training, but even they have found that it's tricky to measure student outcome change. You know, we have this idea of, proximal to distal. The further away we get away from what we can control, it's really hard to measure that flow-on effect because schools are really complicated places. Um, but what we can see at this sort of close sort of proximal range that I looked at was, does this professional learning have an impact on the people it was designed for? And that's what we found. The next step, of course, is, well, doing this, does it actually change what they do in the classroom? So that would be a lovely extension of this work in the future.
That's incredible. And to think about a lot of these supports that they've had, the feeling reassured as well for them to know that they can break it down and how many students it actually works for. Because I so frequently think about there might be two students with DLD in a classroom, but now
Mm,
we know that idea of DLD and learning difficulties. So, how many
mm,
students do we have with learning difficulties that haven't necessarily been diagnosed with
yeah.
DLD? How many students do we have with other conditions? And language disorder is associated with these conditions. So, if we're thinking about a classroom, really, are we looking at like 25 to 35%? That where we think about if we're supporting students with DLD, but actually we're supporting a lot more students as well in just
I would say that the support strategies are good for all and harm nobody.
yeah.
So if I was to be so bold as to say, I actually think that a lot of what we're talking about, where it's providing additional time, scaffolding, you know, to be able to check for comprehension, these are strategies that work for all learners in the classroom, and they're not actually going to hurt anybody. Um, so I think that there's something to be said around this concept of, universal design for learning and thinking about making sure that environments are accessible for all learners, that actually when we think about those, like those with dyslexia or autistic or who are autistic or I don't know, have a hearing loss, actually when we think about those who need the most support, we can actually make really incredibly accessible and supportive classrooms. Um, and it doesn't have to be significantly different to what we did before. It just is that level of awareness.
And I think about Victoria's move to explicit teaching and talking about
Yeah.
explicit teaching and how that is actually going to really support all of our students and all of our students with needs.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that would be an interesting project at some point. We don't really understand the pedagogical practices of teaching people with DLD. I
Mhm.
think it's a really interesting, my assumption is that explicit instruction would be better for a person with DLD. Um, but I don't know to my knowledge that it's been investigated. So certainly thinking about pedagogical practices and the work we do, I would lean into explicit instruction for students with DLD. I think that makes theoretically the best sense. Um, but yeah, good research question for the future.
Yeah, that's right. Shaun, where to from now? Like, what you've completed your PhD. it's in its publication phase,
Yeah, working on,
DLD.
yeah, a
Yeah.
couple of things being published at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah. And once it's published, what are a few things you would love uh, for your PhD information to be used or into? Yeah.
Look, I'm going to go big and bold. Given the fact that developmental language disorder is one of the most prevalent neurodevelopmental conditions in schools, I would love to see a national agenda that includes developmental language disorder as a priority area. One of the biggest challenges we face in our current education system is that whilst we have a national curriculum and we have the nationally consistent collection of data and national legislation, implementation of education sits at a state and territory level. So impacting change at a state and territory level is going to take a long time. You know, we've got 8 states and territories, and within that, we've got public systems, private systems, religious institutions. So we've got lots of different barriers to having a national conversation around developmental language disorder. Certainly, I'd love to see our education minister calling for a review of the work that we do, but it will be a challenging review. We know that if speech pathologists are present in education systems, we're more likely to have conversations around communication conditions like DLD. In the state where I work, we've got speech pathologists employed in our state education system where almost all, I'm going to say all schools will have access to a speech pathologist in some capacity, as well as some of our Catholic schools will have that, and private schools might buy in or work in collaboration with private practices. But if you hop straight across the border to New South Wales, there are very, very, very few speech pathologists employed in the education system under a very, very different service delivery model. So access and inclusion will be dictated by the types of services we have. And we have 8 very different states and territories when it comes to speech pathology services. Within that, we've got very different systems. But if we have a national conversation around DLD, that's why I said I'm going big and bold, because I thought we could beat around the bush and say, I really want, every child. No, I want the government to sit up, pay attention, and actually listen. Because if you educate and support people with DLD, in my mind, they are the perfect group to be funding. Because with the right supports, they will go on and have amazing opportunities. I've met some phenomenal adults with DLD who have persisted despite all of the odds and barriers put against them, who they want to go on and contribute meaningfully, live a life of their own choosing. And if the government was to support them in achieving that, they will go on with less impacts in terms of their communication, greater access to further education, greater access to employment, and then contributing back to the system that has supported them in their childhood. So, that's my big aspiration for the education system, complete and utter reform at a federal level. But I'll take at the moment the emails that I get from teachers who just write the most beautiful things about how training and awareness has helped increase and open their eyes to the work that they're doing with the child in front of them. Because at both ends of that scale, in both of those situations, I think that they have such beautiful, could have such beautiful impact for lots of people around Australia.
Absolutely. And then to further support your vision, Shaun, of taking the conversation nationally, how can we help? And by we, I mean people with DLD, speech and language pathologists, teachers, whoever's working within that space, parents, caregivers. How do we
Mm.
help support that vision?
The number one, uh, the number one thing that people can be doing is sharing their stories. We have a national agenda with politicians in the driving seat. And unfortunately, at this point in time, many families aren't prepared or willing to share their stories. And I know that it's tough. It's so tough. Families will say they don't want to be the face of it. They don't want to put their child in the limelight. But what we need is for people with their lived experience to stand up and share their experiences, be noticed, because at the end of the day, these policymakers don't give two hoots about me. I'm a, academic who happens to have a business that, very passionate about DLD, but I don't have children with DLD. I don't have DLD. And I can shake, rattle, and roll that cage as much as possible, but it's not the same. We need people with DLD and their families to write to their politicians to advocate for funding, whether it's health through Medicare, NDIS, which is poorly represented by people with DLD, education agenda, whatever it is most passionate to you that is impacting you on a day-to-day basis, write and share that. For speech pathologists who are listening in, keep doing what you're doing. You are amazing, amazing, amazing people who we take for granted the fact that as communication specialists, we have this role to play in helping people with communication conditions to reach whatever goal it is they want in life. And actually, by providing that support and that service, you're creating a future generation of young people who will be able to share their stories because you've worked on that vocabulary goal. You've worked on that discourse goal to be able to help them put their thoughts into words. You'll be able to do all of these amazing things because you have provided them with that opportunity to learn and get those skills. For teachers, I'd be saying keep on advocating for change at the local level. It is tough, but school leaders need to hear about DLD. We need to be advocating at a school level for change, and that will eventually, we need this sort of top and bottom approach. We need this sort of groundswell, but we need the policymakers, and eventually I hope we'll meet in the middle somewhere in a, happy utopia where all people with DLD are recognised, understood and supported. But until that day, we kind of all need to get involved. And yeah, I just kind of call on people that it is a little lonely. Sometimes people say, the DLD project or Shaun, should you do more? And I think I actually can't do it by myself. I can't do it without your support. I can't be the sole receptacle of all of this need in our national, state, territory, and local community. But by hell, I'd love to partner with people. I love talking to people. I love, framing things, talking about it, how to push that sort of message out there. So please, please, please reach out and share, together, a problem shared is a problem halved. So hopefully we can get lots of people to share in all of these problems, but eventually work together so that we can see impressive change.
Yes. Thank you so much, Shaun, for taking the time and spending this energy into explaining your PhD and what you would like out of it. It's been invaluable for me as a speechie to be thinking about these things a little bit differently. Has there been anything that I haven't asked you that you've wanted to share?
No, I managed to squeeze assessment in. That was one thing I didn't think you were going to ask me, but I managed to get assessment in there because I think assessment is important. I think at the end of the day, there is 1.8 million Australians sitting out there that are either diagnosed, but mostly undiagnosed, with a government system that isn't set up to recognize them, certainly not set up to support them. And I fear that without change, we've got a national health crisis coming on our hands. If we don't do something about this soon, we're in dire straits. So I think we need to be talking about this. We're spending millions of dollars on educational supports and millions of dollars on behavior supports and social emotional programs that do not at their core consider the fact that there's going to be a large group of people who need those that don't have the communication skills to access them. So if we assume that many people needing these support programs have communication needs,
Mhm.
then that's a really big and important step in the right direction. And you know, speech pathologists are few and far between. There's only, what, 15,000 or so of us in the country, but tap one of us on the shoulder.
Yeah.
We're a really passionate group. We could talk about communication until the cows come home. You know, so please ask us and we will talk to you about communication and making those adjustments. And when those opportunities occur, oh, it's like a beautiful match made in heaven. I think sometimes speech pathologists kind of get a little bit forgotten about, but we've got amazing superpowers and we are passionate and we are very willing to share. So tap a speechy on the shoulder and ask us to get involved.
Um, Thank you so much, Shaun. I do agree with you that we do get it. We've forgotten about, but I think because of the
Like the ugly
complexity.
stepsister,
Yeah, that's right.
the beautiful stepsister
Yeah.
who still gets overlooked.
Yes, yes. And communication can just so easily be taken for granted as well, that everybody is communicating in some capacity or not. But yeah, thinking about let's make the world a little bit better and more accessible. Thank you so much, Shaun. I really, really do appreciate your time. For everybody else that's going to be listening in on this conversation, please share it with somebody that works at a school that just, I think, look, so many people might get benefit from the conversation. And when Shaun's PhD is published, whenever that is, I'll add it to this conversation. So, yes,
So
please.
we've got a couple of papers, 2 out of 4. We're getting there.
Also, yes, that's right. And I will share some of the ones that you've already published with this conversation. So, thank you. The Human Chapters conversation will be available on Human Chapters YouTube channel and podcast platforms as well. Thanks, everyone.
Perfect. Thanks.